Number 1. Clifford W. Baker was 15 years old when he crossed the road in the tiny Fayette County community of Lugoti, Illinois, and walked into the lives and the bedrooms of his neighbors, John Michael, Mike Mahone, and Deborah Tish. Classmates and teachers had known him as a quiet student who could be polite at school but volatile outside of it. Home was complicated. Relatives later described an alcoholic, sometimes harsh father, a distant relationship with his mother, and a boy who had begun to drift. In the months before the crimes, his behavior escalated, and on the night in question he mixed alcohol with pills, a cocktail that would loom over the case but never excuse it. Before dawn on a warm August morning, August 4th, 2010, Baker moved between houses on his rural road. He first entered the Krajewska residence, where a husband recognized the intruder as the neighborhood teenager and forced him to flee. Minutes later, deputies converged on Baker's home, encountering a confused, agitated 15-year-old who had to be subdued and taken for medical evaluation. When a deputy, worried about the neighbors next door, pushed open their back door and looked inside, he found Mike Mahone and Deborah Tish unresponsive in their bed. The scene pointed to gunfire while the couple slept. Baker would later give a recorded statement at the hospital. The jury ultimately heard a timeline that tied his movements, his texts, the recovered weapons, and forensic results into a continuous chain. In court the following year, Baker was tried as an adult. A Fayette County jury convicted him of 2 counts of first-degree murder and multiple counts of home invasion. At the initial sentencing in late September of 2011, the judge imposed natural life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murders, plus additional terms for the home invasions. Family members of the victims described a pair who loved fishing, taught nieces and nephews, and filled their small town with easy kindness. Baker apologized, but the sentence reflected a view at the time that left no avenue for release. That changed years later, after high court rulings reshaped how American courts punish juveniles. The Illinois Appellate Court vacated the mandatory natural life terms and ordered a new sentencing hearing, recognizing that a child's diminished culpability and capacity for change must be considered. On resentencing in early April of 2017, a different judge imposed an aggregate term of 85 years, consecutive terms for the 2 murders, and additional time for the home invasions, with some portions concurrent. The court described it as a de facto life sentence, noting that the no-good time structure meant decades would be served in full. What pushed a 15-year-old toward this violence? The record offers fragments rather than a single answer. Witnesses spoke of turbulence at home, earlier self-harm with a firearm, and antidepressant use around the time of the offense. Toxicology showed alcohol and marijuana after his arrest. Mental health experts debated his state of mind, yet the appellate court later affirmed there was no evidence of psychosis at the time of the killings. In jail and prison, defense lawyers pointed to classroom progress and structured behavior as signs that he could mature, while prosecutors emphasized the calculated movement between homes and the vulnerability of sleeping victims. These competing narratives, capacity for change versus the weight of the acts, framed both the resentencing and subsequent appeals. As of the most recent public records, Clifford W. Baker remains in the custody of the Illinois Department of Corrections at Pinckneyville Correctional Center under the 85-year sentence imposed in 2017. Number 2. David Biro was 16 years old, a suburban high school student in Winnetka, Illinois, when he stepped over the line from a troubled fascination with crime into an act that would define the rest of his life. Neighbors knew his family. Classmates knew him from New Trier High School. Investigators later learned he kept clippings about notorious local violence and had acquired burglary tools and a handgun he admitted stealing months earlier. On an April evening in the late 1980s, he walked to the townhome of Richard and Nancy Langert, a young married couple expecting their first child, and forced his way inside. He waited there for them to return. What followed would leave a quiet North Shore community stunned and searching for answers that never fully came. In the months before the crime, people close to him saw a teenager enthralled by infamy and weapons, a boy who seemed to crave recognition and control. Prosecutors later argued that he was motivated less by profit and more by a desire for notoriety. Friends described conversations in which he boasted about breaking in, cutting a pane to gain entry, and lying in wait. Those statements, coupled with the stolen gun he had obtained from a lawyer's office, drew a picture of planning rather than impulse. While defense attorneys insisted he was exaggerating to impress peers and maintained his innocence, the portrait that emerged in court was of a youth whose appetite for attention had turned predatory. The crime itself unfolded inside the Langards' townhome on a Saturday in early April of 1990. The couple came home. A confrontation ensued. The next day, family members raised alarms, and soon the community's worst fears were confirmed. The victims were Richard and Nancy, and with them the child she was carrying. There were no signs of a feud or robbery gone wrong that could anchor the story to a comprehensible motive. The randomness amplified the shock, especially in a place still haunted by a separate tragedy carried out by another offender a few years earlier. For months, the case stalled without a named suspect. Then, a classmate came forward. He told Winnetka detectives that David had described the killings in detail and had shown him the gun. That tip unlocked the investigation. A search of David's bedroom uncovered the handgun, glass cutters, handcuffs, similar to those recovered at the scene, and other items that matched the story the witness had relayed. When the case went to trial, David took the stand and claimed he had been joking and that another teen was responsible. But jurors found that explanation implausible in light of the physical evidence and his admissions to peers. The Cook County jury convicted him of the murders of Richard and Nancy, the intentional homicide of their unborn child, home invasion, and burglary. Because he was 16 at the time of the crime, capital punishment was not an option. The judge imposed mandatory natural life sentences for the adult victims and an additional discretionary life term for the intentional homicide of the unborn child. In court, relatives expressed bewilderment that David offered no motive. One sister said the silence would be part of their family's life sentence. Over the years that followed, he pressed appeals and post-conviction petitions, arguing that juvenile sentencing law had evolved and that his case warranted reconsideration. Courts rejected those efforts, and a Cook County judge again denied resentencing in the early 2020s. Psychologically, the record gestures at a young man hungry for infamy and control, steeped in stories of violence and armed with a stolen weapon, rather than at a concrete personal grievance against the victims. Journalists and authors who later met him have written about his reserve and about the long journey of the victim's family toward forgiveness. But in the legal file, the motive remains opaque. Experts have debated how adolescent development and impulsivity should factor into punishment. The trial judge, however, called the killings cold-blooded and concluded that the nature of the acts outweighed mitigation. Today, David Biro remains in the custody of the Illinois Department of Corrections, serving life terms without the possibility of parole at Pinckneyville Correctional Center. Number 3. Timothy D. Buss was a boy from Kankakee County whose life veered into darkness before he reached his teen years. As a preteen in the early 1980s, he lived in a working-class circle of relatives around Bradley, Illinois. Adults described a child who drifted between homes, struggled with supervision, and sometimes lied to cover his tracks. By adolescence, he had begun to show an unsettling mix of secrecy and calculation. In late spring of 1981, the disappearance and death of a neighborhood kindergartner shattered that community and placed a 12-year-old at the center of a homicide investigation. The psychological picture that emerges from court records is not clinical but behavioral. A youth who sought control, rehearsed stories, and inserted himself into the search for the missing child. Detectives would later say his account of the day was too neat, his details too rehearsed, and his demeanor off-key for someone who claimed to be a bystander. Years later, when he was paroled as a young adult after serving time for that first conviction, those same traits, planning, secrecy, the urge to manipulate, were cited again as red flags that had never truly changed. The first crime unfolded in late May of 1981. A 5-year-old girl left home to play and never returned. That evening, Timothy told neighbors he had found her in a secluded spot near a landfill and led adults and police back to the area. Investigators quickly spotted inconsistencies in his story and physical traces that linked him to her movements. A transfer hearing sent his case to adult court, a jury convicted him of murder, and he received a multi-decade sentence. After more than a decade in custody, he was released on parole. Then, in early August of 1995, another child, this time a 10-year-old visiting the riverfront at Aroma Park, vanished. Within days, searchers found his body in a shallow grave inside Kankakee River State Park, and attention turned to the paroled child killer living in the area. The investigation into the second case developed swiftly. Witness timelines and physical evidence mapped the boy's last known movements and placed Timothy back under scrutiny. Detectives obtained and searched his property and vehicle. Prosecutors convened a grand jury and returned multiple counts of first-degree murder, along with related charges. At trial, the state relied on the sequence of events, forensic findings, and testimony about Timothy's post-abduction behavior. The defense attacked the searches and suggested alternative narratives, but jurors were persuaded that the chain of proof pointed to the same man who had once claimed to discover a victim and was now on parole for a child's killing. The legal outcome was stark. A Will County jury convicted him of the murder of the 10-year-old, and he was sentenced to death. On direct review, the Illinois Supreme Court affirmed his conviction and sentence. Then, in January of 2003, Illinois Governor George Ryan commuted all death sentences in the state, converting Timothy's punishment to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Over the years, he has filed collateral attacks seeking to shorten his time, arguing search issues and other claims. But courts have rejected those efforts. What motivated him? The record does not supply a single diagnosis or a neat cause. Instead, it shows an adolescent who learned to mask emotions, who sought control over smaller children, and who returned to predatory behavior after release. Experts and officials have pointed to enduring risk factors, impulsivity layered on planning, manipulation, and an absence of credible remorse as more telling than any one label. The families of both children have spoken publicly about grief, vigilance, and the limits of closure when answers remain incomplete. Today, according to the Illinois Department of Corrections, Timothy D. Buss remains in state custody, serving a life term without parole. As of early October of 2025, he is listed at Big Muddy River Correctional Center. Number 4. Regina DeFrancisco was a Chicago teenager in her late teens when she began seeing Oscar Velasquez, a young truck driver known by friends and family as dependable and kind. She lived in the Pilsen neighborhood with her younger sister, Margaret, and their mother. Accounts from reporters and detectives describe Regina as charismatic, with her little sister looking up to her and often following her lead. In the early summer of 2000, the new relationship spiraled into something far darker. Investigators would later say that the sisters cultivated a plan around Oscar's trust, setting in motion a crime that would leave a community searching for answers. What pushed the teenagers there was never reduced to a single diagnosis. Prosecutors argued the motive mixed money, control, and a desire to redirect blame, noting that Regina tried to steer detectives toward a different suspect during initial questioning. Friends and a third teenager in their circle, Veronica Garcia, were drawn into the orbit of the case, and phone records placed Oscar in contact with Regina shortly before he disappeared. The picture that emerged was of escalating risk-taking and an increasingly volatile peer dynamic between the sisters and their friends. Rather than a sudden, impulsive snap, Oscar's last night began with an invitation to the DeFrancisco home. According to police and later courtroom narratives, he was lured there on the promise of resolving a dispute over money. Inside that house, he was shot, and his body was later transported in his own car to a vacant lot on Chicago's South Side. To destroy evidence, an accelerant was used and the body set on fire. The burned car was later found as well. Detectives recovered blood evidence and a spent casing inside the home, and sheets that matched those used to wrap the remains. None of these findings required graphic detail to convey the gravity of what happened. They formed a forensic trail that led back to the sisters. At first, Regina and Margaret were questioned and released. Within days, they fled. For nearly 2 years, they lived as fugitives, their case profiled on national television segments about wanted suspects. Tips finally broke the stalemate. Margaret was located first in northern Illinois. After a televised re-airing renewed attention to the case. Months later, Regina was arrested in Texas following a run-in with local police that revealed she was wanted in Chicago. Both were returned to Cook County to stand trial. In court, prosecutors presented physical evidence from the home and testimony from Veronica Garcia, who described obtaining a handgun for the sisters and detailed the plot surrounding the killing and the burning of the remains. Defense lawyers argued self-defense and sought to undermine Garcia's credibility. But two separate juries reached different points on different days. Regina was found guilty first. Margaret's initial panel hung, leading to a mistrial and a later retrial. Ultimately, both sisters were convicted of first-degree murder in separate proceedings in the second half of 2004. Regina received a term of 35 years. Margaret received a total of 46 years. A judgment that withstood direct appeal and later post-conviction challenges. Psychologically, the record points to peer reinforcement, financial stress, and an effort to control the narrative after the fact. Detectives highlighted how quickly the sisters tried to deflect attention, while the judge and jurors emphasized planning, cleanup, and flight as indicators of intent rather than panic. There was no credible evidence that Oscar posed an imminent threat inside that home. The trial judge characterized the conduct as deliberate and the efforts to erase evidence as telling. Today, Illinois Department of Corrections records list both Regina DeFrancisco and Margaret DeFrancisco as in custody at Logan Correctional Center, serving their respective sentences imposed in 2004. Number 5. John Granat was a suburban Chicago high school senior in his late teens when he turned from a frustrated only child into the architect of a plan that would end his parents' lives. Classmates knew him as quiet and sometimes sullen. At home, tension had been building after his parents discovered marijuana plants and tightened the rules. Prosecutors later said he started flashing cash to keep certain friendships alive, and by late summer he was sounding out 3 friends, Christopher Wyma, Ehab Qasim, and Mohammed Salahat, about a way to make his anger permanent. The motive, as jurors eventually heard, mixed resentment, money, and control. Friends described a teenager eager to impress, someone who wanted others to do what he would not do himself. Investigators later recovered online messages the group used to coordinate, a code word that turned talk into action, and statements that placed John at the center of the plot, promising stacks of his parents' cash to anyone who would go through with it. The picture that emerged was not of a sudden explosion, but of a plan rehearsed in late-night conversations and whispered car rides. In the early hours of a Sunday in early September of 2011, the plan moved from talk to reality at the Granat family's house near Palos Park. According to testimony, Salahat waited in a car while Wyma and Qasim went inside. John stayed close, steering and encouraging, then later called 911 with a practice story about waking up to find a scene that suggested a home invasion. Detectives arriving at the house found no forced entry. Within hours, an officer in a nearby suburb reported a pre-dawn traffic stop that undercut John's claim that he had been home asleep. Confronted with those contradictions, his timeline shifted, and the focus of the investigation narrowed. From there, the case moved quickly. Phone records, witness accounts, and physical evidence tied the co-defendants together. Qasim took a deal to testify, accepting a decades-long sentence in exchange for his cooperation. He told jurors about planning sessions, promised payouts, and a cold directive from the friend who stood to gain the most. Wyma was tried alongside John before separate juries, while Salahat, who had acted as the driver, entered his own plea the prior year. The narrative that prosecutors laid out emphasized planning, cleanup, and the division of cash afterward, details that jurors could weigh without any need for graphic descriptions. The verdicts came after about a week of testimony. John was found guilty of the murders of his parents, John and Maria, and later received a natural life sentence without the possibility of parole in the Illinois Department of Corrections. Wyma received concurrent natural life terms. Qasim, who testified, received a 40-year sentence. Salahat received a comparable term under his plea. On appeal, John argued that police lacked probable cause for his warrantless arrest, and that key evidence should have been suppressed. The Illinois Appellate Court rejected those claims and affirmed his conviction, concluding that the totality of circumstances, his shifting stories, the lack of forced entry, the pre-dawn stop, and the evidence tying him to planning supported the arrest and the trial court's rulings. Psychologically, the record suggests a teenager whose grievance hardened into entitlement and whose need to keep status with peers outweighed family ties. Prosecutors highlighted how he kept, as one courtroom description put it, his hands clean, while directing others, a portrait of manipulation rather than panic. Defense lawyers countered that he was a follower and a foolish kid bragging to stronger personalities. But jurors credited the testimony about orchestration and incentive, and judges later pointed to the planning and aftermath as markers of intent. Today, John Granat is serving natural life without the possibility of parole in the Illinois Department of Corrections. His conviction and sentence affirmed on appeal. Number 6. Sarah Ann Kolb was 16 years old, a high school junior in the Quad Cities. When she crossed a line that would define the rest of her life, classmates knew her as confident and magnetic. Teachers saw a teenager navigating friendships, status, and control. In the winter of the mid-2000s, a new student, Adrienne Reynolds, arrived with the optimism of a fresh start. What began as ordinary rivalry inside a small teenage circle would harden into a plan, one that pulled in Sarah's then-boyfriend, Cory Gregory, and set off a search that would end with heartbreak across 2 states. The pressure points were classic adolescent triggers amplified by poor choices: jealousy over attention, shifting alliances, and an escalating need to assert control. Prosecutors later argued that Sarah's anger at Adrienne's connection with Cory mixed with a desire to dominate the social dynamic. Friends described conversations that moved from gossip to logistics. In the record that followed, investigators sketched a portrait of a teenager who tested boundaries, gathered accomplices, and tried to script what would happen next. On a cold January afternoon in the city of Moline, the trio met up under the pretense of grabbing lunch. According to trial testimony, an argument inside a parked car turned into a coordinated assault in which Cory restrained Adrienne while Sarah used a belt to compress her airway. In the hours that followed, instead of calling for help, they focused on erasing what had happened, transporting the remains to rural property linked to Sarah's family, and attempting to destroy evidence. When that failed, they sought help from another teen, whose later statements helped detectives reconstruct the sequence. Days passed before authorities, following leads from school and work, homed in on the small circle that had last been seen with Adrienne. Cory ultimately led law enforcement to the rural site, and the search became a homicide investigation. Detectives built the case through interviews, phone records, and items recovered from vehicles and property. The state charged Sarah with first-degree murder and concealment of a homicidal death. Cory faced parallel counts. Separate juries heard overlapping evidence about planning, the confrontation in the car near a fast food restaurant, and the attempts to cover up the crime. In late summer of 2006, a judge sentenced Sarah to a term totaling 53 years, decades for murder plus additional time for concealment. Cory received 45 years, structured as time for murder and time for concealment, after his own proceedings concluded. The rulings reflected a view that the actions were planned, sustained, and followed by deliberate efforts to mislead. Over the years, both defendants pursued relief in court. Cory, who now identifies as female and uses the name Harli Quinn, won a resentencing hearing under evolving juvenile sentencing law, but received the same total term after the judge reviewed the record and heard from the victim's family. Sarah sought resentencing as well, arguing that juvenile factors and capacity for change required a new look. In early March of 2023, the Illinois Appellate Court affirmed the dismissal of her petition, finding no constitutional error in the original sentence. Local coverage documented the family's statements and the court's conclusion that the punishment remained lawful under current standards. Psychologically, the case file points less to a diagnosable syndrome than to adolescent jealousy fused with a need for control and status. Expert debates about youth impulsivity appear in the broader jurisprudence. But in this record, judges emphasized planning, leadership in the offending, and determined efforts to conceal what happened. Journalists who revisited the case on anniversaries have highlighted the enduring grief of Adrienne's loved ones and the continuing impact on the community that once welcomed her. Today, Illinois Department of Corrections records list Sarah Ann Kolb in custody at Logan Correctional Center. Cory Gregory, now known as Harli Quinn, remains in state custody at Pontiac Correctional Center, serving the reimposed 45-year term. Number 7. Keith Thomas Randulich was a suburban Chicago high school senior in his late teens. Living with his family in Mokina, Illinois, teachers described him as academically capable. Classmates saw a quiet student who mostly kept to himself. At home, he shared space with siblings, including his much younger half-sister, a 4-year-old girl named Sabrina Clement. In late spring of 2009, while his parents were out and another sibling was upstairs, Keith made a decision that would end a life and alter his own forever. In the months around the crime, Keith voiced a belief that his little sister was being harmed by a family member. Detectives and later prosecutors would say that claim became his justification for a plan he formed on his own. Medical findings did not substantiate the abuse he alleged, but in interviews after his arrest he returned to the same rationale, describing what he framed as a desperate act to protect her. The picture that emerged was not of a sudden psychotic break, but of a brooding, increasingly distorted reasoning that mixed fear, anger, and a misguided sense of rescue. The crime happened on a Friday evening in late May of 2009 in the basement of the family's home. Afterward, Keith made a call for help and spoke with officers who arrived on scene. He was taken into custody that night. In subsequent interviews, he admitted responsibility and offered the same explanation. He believed he could not reach or punish the person he thought was abusing his sister, so he turned on the child he claimed to love. Detectives also recovered items from the basement that suggested a fascination with violent media, details that would later surface in coverage of the case. Prosecutors charged Keith with first-degree murder in Will County. The case moved swiftly through the courts. That winter, he entered a guilty plea, waiving a trial. At sentencing the following spring, the state pressed for a natural life term or, failing that, an extended term that would effectively ensure he never left prison. The judge rejected a life sentence and imposed a determinate term measured in decades. Reporters in the courtroom noted that Keith, then a 19-year-old, stood silent as the sentence was read. The ruling reflected the court's view that, even accepting his stated fears, the act itself and its planning were deliberate and unforgivable under the law. In the public eye, the case drew intense response. Community grief centered on the loss of a child and on how a family would ever make sense of a tragedy that unfolded inside their own home. School officials arranged counseling for students and staff at Lincoln Way East High School, where Keith had been close to graduation. Local media revisited the story at each milestone plea, sentencing, anniversaries, often emphasizing both the unanswered questions about motive and the court's clear stance that his explanations did not excuse the crime. Psychologically, what can be said with confidence comes from the official record. Keith articulated a vigilante rationale. There is no clinical diagnosis publicly credited by the court. Rather, prosecutors and the sentencing judge focused on his expressed intent, his ability to act when adults were away, and his subsequent admissions to police. In that sense, the case is often cited as an example of how adolescent reasoning, left unchecked, can calcify into catastrophic choices, an observation echoed by the state's attorney when urging a severe penalty. Today, according to the Illinois Department of Corrections, Keith Thomas Randulich remains in state custody at Pontiac Correctional Center. His sentence is 40 years, with a projected parole eligibility in late May of 2049 and a projected discharge in late May of 2052. Number 8. Anna Schroeder was a 15-year-old from the small city of Morrison in northern Illinois, a quiet student navigating early independence, a first serious relationship, and the boundaries set by her adoptive mother, Peggy Schroeder. Friends would later describe a household under strain, with arguments about curfews, phone use, and the new girlfriend Rachel Helm. In early July of 2017, that tension reached a breaking point inside the family's modest home, and a decision Anna made there would define the rest of her life. In the weeks leading up to the shooting, investigators later testified, Anna and Rachel messaged each other about running away and about their anger toward Peggy. Prosecutors argued those exchanges showed planning rather than an impulsive outburst. According to local reporting and hearing testimony, after the fatal shot, Anna called Rachel, sent images to prove what had happened, and asked for help. The portrait that emerged in court was of two teenagers caught in a feedback loop of fear, defiance, and immaturity, escalating each other's worst ideas instead of seeking an adult's help. The crime occurred on a Thursday in early July inside the Schroeder home. What followed stretched into days. Rather than calling 911, the girls focused on concealment, cleaning, moving items, and discussing how to leave town. The next day, they bought supplies and changed their appearance. By the weekend, a small fire inside the house drew neighbors' attention. Firefighters responding to the scene discovered Peggy's body, and the case shifted quickly from a suspicious fire to a homicide. Detectives soon learned that Rachel's mother had dropped her at the house the night after the shooting, and that the teens had discussed fleeing together. When officers could not reach Anna, they found her later at her father's residence in the nearby town of Walnut. The investigation moved fast. Phone records and interviews tied the timeline together, including the messages before and after the killing. Within days, Anna was charged as an adult with first-degree murder, arson, and concealment. In early January of 2020, as juvenile sentencing law continued to evolve in Illinois, she accepted a plea to second-degree murder. That agreement removed the higher counts and set up a sentencing range that ran from a low single-digit term to 2 decades. In early November of 2021, after a 2-day hearing that included testimony from a lead detective and a statement from Peggy's sister, the judge imposed the maximum, 20 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections, followed by a year of mandatory supervised release, with credit for years already served in detention. Rachel Helm faced separate charges for her role after the shooting. In early March of 2022, she pleaded guilty to arson and concealment of a homicidal death and later received a sentence of more than a decade in state prison. In court, she apologized to the family. Local coverage noted the judge's conclusion that her rights had not been violated in earlier proceedings. Those outcomes, along with the plea that spared a public trial in Anna's case, drew strong reactions from relatives who spoke about grief, anger, and the lasting shock inside a small community. Psychologically, the public record offers a limited window. There is no formal diagnosis credited by the court. Instead, the filings and testimony point to adolescent jealousy, fear of separation, and a naive belief that they could erase consequences. At sentencing, the judge emphasized that despite Rachel's influence, Anna knew right from wrong, planned the act, and then attempted to destroy evidence. Reporters in the courtroom captured Anna's statement, accepting that this is how people would know her, and the judge's conclusion that the conduct demanded the statutory maximum. Today, state corrections records and local reporting list Anna Schroeder as in custody at Logan Correctional Center, serving a 20-year sentence for second-degree murder, with credit for time served and standard Illinois day-for-day provisions determining her projected release window. Number 9. Dakota Wall was a teenager in the small southern Illinois town of Pinckneyville when her fractured relationship with her younger half-sister, Sidnee Stevens, slid from everyday sibling tension into something far more dangerous. Friends knew Dakota as part of a loose circle of older boys who hung around the house. Prosecutors later said she used that access to open a door, literally, that would lead Sidnee out of safety. On a warm night in mid-July of 2010, Sidnee, a 15-year-old high schooler, vanished from her bedroom. Less than a week later, fishermen spotted a body in a rural creek, and the case became a homicide. The emotional trigger, as reconstructed by detectives in the court, was not one sudden fight, but a simmering resentment mixed with pressure from peers. Investigators argued that Dakota told her friends she was tired of the conflict and wanted Sidnee frightened. In the weeks beforehand, that fantasy hardened into planning. 4 young men in her orbit, Robbie Mueller, James Glazier, Chad Bennett, and Carl Dane, were pulled into the center of the scheme. What Dakota later described as a plan to scare her sister, authorities said, became a blueprint for an abduction that moved the danger far beyond pranks or posturing. What happened next began at the family's home and ended beside a secluded stretch of Boku Creek. According to charging documents and later testimony, Dakota left a door unlocked so the boys could get inside. Sidnee was taken from the house, forced into a car, and driven to the water's edge. There, the violence escalated. Days later, a fisherman's call led authorities to the creek, where the body was recovered. The discovery set off an urgent push to reconstruct the hours after Sidnee disappeared, and to understand the roles that each person played. The investigation stretched on, in part because one of the key participants died by suicide after pleading guilty to murder. Carl Dane admitted his role and received a long sentence, but he was found dead in the county jail before transfer to state prison. James Glazier and Robbie Mueller were prosecuted and received decades-long terms. Chad Bennett, whose case was initially dropped for lack of evidence, was charged again years later and ultimately sentenced on a reduced count. Dakota, meanwhile, kept her silence for more than 2 years before detectives traced the planning back to her. She was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, home invasion, and burglary. In late May of 2014, Dakota pleaded guilty to a single count of home invasion. The judge emphasized the act that made everything else possible, leaving the door open so armed young men could enter a sleeping girl's home. He imposed a term of 26 years, crediting her with time served in jail but noting her prolonged silence after the killing. Local coverage documented the community's shock and the judge's search from the bench for any sign of remorse as he weighed her role against the magnitude of the outcome. Why did she do it? The record offers no psychiatric diagnosis and no tidy motive. Prosecutors argued that resentment and the need to impress older peers fueled the plot. Defense counsel said she never intended Sidnee to be killed and was paralyzed by fear after realizing what her friends had done. The court cut through those competing stories to focus on conduct, deliberate access provided to dangerous actors, participation in planning, and secrecy afterward. For a small town already rattled by the brutality of the crime, the revelation that an older sister had unlocked the door added a layer of disbelief that rippled through school hallways and local headlines for years. As of the most recent records, Dakota Wall's conviction for home invasion stands. She received a 26-year sentence in the Illinois Department of Corrections. State and local reporting indicate she later paroled after roughly 8 years, with her supervision administered through an interstate compact. Number 10. Eliza Wasni was 16 years old, a Northwest Side Chicago teenager who had bounced between a neighborhood public high school and a therapeutic day program. Friends and teachers recalled a quiet, sometimes withdrawn student. In the final days of May in the year 2017, she moved through the night alone, first across suburbs, then into a big box store, before taking actions that would end a stranger's life and lock her own into a prison sentence measured in decades. The man she encountered was Grant Nelson, a 34-year-old Uber driver from the North Shore, described by family as gentle, curious, and devoted to animals and classical music. What led a 16-year-old there has never been clearly explained. Prosecutors would later tell the court that a firm motive could not be established, though they noted disturbing comments and behavior while she was in custody. Before the attack, she had been escorted from school settings for behavioral issues, and in the months after her arrest, officials documented self-harm and ongoing volatility. The defense did not offer a comprehensive psychological diagnosis at sentencing. Instead, the record suggests adolescent instability that escalated into planning and predation in the early morning hours. Shortly after midnight in late May, she used ride-hailing to move between suburbs, eventually arriving at a 24-hour Walmart on Toohey Avenue in Skokie. Security footage later showed her removing a hunting knife and a short machete from displays and walking out without paying. No employee contacted police. Minutes later, along nearby Lincoln Avenue in Lincolnwood, she used the app again and was matched with Nelson. Within seconds of sitting in the back seat, according to investigators and witnesses, she attacked him from behind. Bleeding, he managed to pull to the curb and escape the car, calling out for help as residents dialed 911. Before he lost consciousness at a hospital, he identified his attacker as the young woman he had just picked up and told a paramedic, "She came at me with a machete." On his phone, the ride-hailing app still displayed the name Eliza. Police soon found Nelson's car abandoned and running, and after a brief search located Wasni hiding behind a nearby building, still carrying both blades. She refused to drop them until officers deployed a taser. She declined to provide a statement after her arrest. In the days that followed, investigators knit together store surveillance video, ride logs, emergency calls, and witness interviews into a tight timeline. Nelson's family, grieving a son and brother known for kindness, spoke publicly about his love of music, animals, and conversation. Charged as an adult with first-degree murder, Wasni initially fought the case in juvenile detention. 3 years later, in late August of the year 2020, she pleaded guilty in Cook County Court. The judge accepted a negotiated disposition and imposed a sentence of 27 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections, to be followed by mandatory supervised release and continued mental health evaluation. Coverage of the hearing noted her youth at the time of the crime and the court's conclusion that the act was planned and swiftly carried out. Separate civil litigation by Nelson's family remains pending against corporate defendants connected to the events that night. Psychologically, the file points to a teenager whose behavior had grown erratic in the months before the killing, and whose actions in the hours beforehand showed preparation and intent. Prosecutors emphasized the theft of weapons, the unaccompanied ride, and the immediate ambush. The defense highlighted her age and mental health history. Ultimately, the court anchored its decision in the facts. A sequence of choices made and a life taken. Today, Eliza Wasni is listed in state custody at Logan Correctional Center, serving a sentence of 27 years for the murder of Grant Nelson.
Beverly Hills emergency.
Yes, police.
What's the problem? What's the problem? What's the problem?
Someone killed my parents.
Pardon me?
Someone killed my parents.
What? Who? Are they still there?
Yes.
The people...
No.
Were they shot?
Hey, man,
Were they shot?
Yes.
They were shot?
Yes.
102 response, 722 North Elmore.
What happened? Hey, stand up,
I have a hysterical person on. We're trying to get screened further. Other units responding. Is the person still there?
What happened? We have units around. What happened? Who shot who?
I don't hear anything. I just came home.
You came home and found who shot?
My mom and dad. You know if they're still in the house, the people that did the shooting.
Get away from him. Okay. Hey, let me talk to Eric. Who is the person that was shot?
My mom and my dad.
Your mom and dad?
My mom and my dad.
Okay, hold on a second. Okay, we're on our way over there with an ambulance.
Okay, I gotta go.
Okay.